So what is trauma? Trauma is a disconnect from your body. You become disembodied. So what happens in a traumatic situation? In a traumatic situation, your nervous system gets overwhelmed and your capacity to cope with that situation breaks down. So basically, you're overwhelmed, and this overwhelm puts you either in a hyper aroused state or in a hypo aroused state. So you get either into fight or flight, or you're going to freeze, shut down. And there are also two other survival styles, which is attach, cry for help, and collapse, submit. So this happens within families, within relationships, or within just situations like natural disasters, car accidents, or just single event instances, right? Which is the normal classic PTSD. But what happens when it's chronic, when it happens repeatedly, especially when you're in a vulnerable age, growing period, such as in your childhood? Then your brain develops in a different way compared to children who weren't abused, who weren't neglected, who weren't abandoned. So given this the situation, right, you have perpetrators, which are unhealthy people, creating an environment of coercion. And what happens is that you adapt to that situation, right? Your body does that for you. So as a child, you learn to fawn, you learn to freeze, or you learn to fight all the time, you become a rebel, and so on and so forth. And in adulthood, that no longer serves you in a society that still is, to some extent, imposing, quote unquote, imposing healthy dynamics. But what happens when such people that create a narcissistic environment which forces your nervous system to adapt to the situation become leaders of a country, and the whole system in that country is such that it imposes a narcissistic environment? Then the whole society adapts to that environment. Then there is complex trauma in mass in the whole society. So what happens in dictatorships, for example? Let's take the example of communism. We saw during World War II that communism was imposed on the Eastern European countries. So countries like Romania, Hungary, Poland, and so on, they became communist after World War II, right? When it was imposed by Stalin. So what happened in these countries? Well, you had repression. So you had a regime where people were tracked down, they were listened to, and not listened in an empathetic way, but listened as in surveillance, right? People would tell each other, sometimes would invent stories about one another so they can escape their fate, right? Trying to escape their fate. There was a purge, as we've seen in Russia, right? With Stalin killing people. And so you get this environment of fear. And in this environment of fear, people adapt. Their nervous system get overwhelmed. So what happens when people get traumatized as a whole society? Like, for example, after wars, right? When some countries perpetrated, either the Nazi countries such as Germany or the communist countries such as USSR. What happens when these countries perpetrate on entire masses? Well, you get complex trauma in mass. And what happens when you get nervous systems that adapt to that complex trauma? Then the healers themselves get traumatized. So what is the solution to this? The solution is to have countries that weren't traumatized, that fought and won, now come to heal the perpetrating countries after they have done a reset and aligned back to democracies, to a democratic system. So this is what happened, right? This is what we've seen with Peter Levine, for example, when he invented somatic experiencing in the 60s, 70s. Then he came to Europe, he came to Germany, and he helped people heal from their single instance trauma, mostly, but also from the complex trauma, the more difficult cases, as he said. So you need an external human being, right, external to your system where you have been traumatized, to help you become healthy again, and thus break the cycle of trauma with the next generations. But what happens when all of these countries become traumatized? Who then can come and heal? What do you do when there is nobody left that is healthy in some manner, may have some trauma, right? But may not have PTSD or CPTSD? What do you do in these cases when everybody around you has PTSD or CPTSD? What do you do then? And that is the question.